Hello, I'm Professor Eric Gilder from the Papua New Guinea University of Technology, and I've been invited to address the 14th Lumen International Scientific Conference in Iași, Romania, May 22nd, 23rd. My keynote presentation, Logos, Pathos, and Ethical Practices Across Selves, Time, and Space in a Pandemic Era. One thing we have all to deal with now is we have to ask ourselves, what are the probable implications for theory, society, and individuals residing within each of the theoretical useful fictions provided to us by any authorial text, be it scientific, social, literary, or political? In that none of these theories of human betterment propounded therein, herein, or elsewhere, are indubitably real, questions of the deontological ethical stance of this implied author, myself, along with the probable utility and consequences of accepting my vision of reality upon others, are the only questions worth asking. Succinctly put, does the siren call of any particular ideologically laden policy stance offered for our assent deserve it, or are we just satisfying our innate prejudice by following it? I have been invited by the organizers of this conference, Rethinking Social Action, Core Values and Practice, to give a keynote, which is a great honor. However, due to the realities of international COVID-19, I cannot be here in person to share the event with you. This brute fact reminds me of an insight offered by the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who distinguished in her book, The Human Condition, two types of work. One, productive craft work, which is defined as producing a unique something that has lasting value. And two, organic work, which is work that always has to be done in a circular repeating process to allow us to survive as human beings. And she gives the examples of household cooking, cleaning, and so forth. Such work does not produce anything of value in itself, according to her theory. In the COVID-19 lockdown we have now, we have to all invert our life script, learning to sit and stay, and you'll see in the next photo cartoon, in our abode for primarily organic reasons to stay healthy. And we have to fit our professional craft work, what we're paid for, around that fact. And it does seem to be the case that learned knowledge workers are quite capable of working from home, while those who are not find it much harder to do. Perhaps this is because, like in Friedrich Nietzsche's idea, that we are have to be trained to be bored. And we have the lack of sit and stay basic under stress. Ironically, I reflect now as children, when we were children, we supposedly learned to control our bodies early on with bodily cognitive skills so that we can then learn to control our emotions, affective skills, and so then we could learn to think productive thoughts with our cognitive skills. Now the pandemic is asking us to become as children again, whereas our core motivation of our ethos is laid bare under pressure. And you see the two dogs here, Mom and her pup. Mom, why are the humans wearing muzzles? And she answers, honey, they're too dumb to learn sit and stay. And as we see in the cited article there from New York Times, I cite all the protests against the lockdown orders that are now occurring in the United States. So the question of the day we face, ethos, it's all in the training. Aristotle had asked, how does a human become good, cultivating excellence within herself? Aristotle had held that this is done by two related but distinct mechanisms. Intellectual excellences arise by teaching. Ethical excellences come by ethos, habilitation, or training. Since pleasure or pain results from each of our activities, training happens through activities, such as one learns to be just by doing just things. And so legislators who aim to make citizens good, therefore must ensure that citizens are trained from childhood to produce good habits, excellence of character within them. Another key term in my work is logos, and this comes from the divine word, the second person of the Trinity, and from the Greek logos, word, speech, statement, discourse, also computation, account, also reason, etc. So it has many different meanings, but they all center around the idea of the word and knowledge and symbolic power and knowledge. Okay. And so this works through words up through rhetoric and into systems. Pathos. Is it a simple thing of animal passion, or is it a cause of human creative action? Now, Aristotle had sort of given the idea that it was, notion of something to be transcended or such, and it's a strong or weak psychological force driven by bodily appetites or emotional desires. But on the other hand, Raymond Williams, a cultural critical theorist, had the notion of structures of feeling, which he thought is a way of talking about how we come to emergent knowledge out of historical knowledge. And he draws from Antonio Gramsci, the theorist, who said that hegemony refers to this idea that you have traditional knowledge, which works into from the past, which is a form of residual knowledge that feeds into the present, and you have a dominant ideology and an oppositional ideology, along with an alternative ideology, vying for power in discourse. And then out of that dialectic, you end up with emergent knowledge, new knowledge. And this structures of feeling could be, in his terms, a way of forming the new ideas that come forth from the conflict between the three knowledges I mentioned in the present. Another theorist I've used a lot, Kenneth Boulding, economist turned social communication theorist, had talked about in his little article published in 1971 in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, the dodo didn't make it, talking about evolution in society. In one of my works on technological drivers in society, I mentioned his 8 vectors of either appreciating or deteriorating change societies can follow. And number one, we have consumption production systems in society. Number 2, we have goods and bads are increasing sometimes due to informational overloads. Number 3, you have joint production of goods and bads in society. Number 4, you have externalities, invisible byproducts of intended good production, and that would be, for example, auto factory making automobiles, the intended goods, and the invisible externalities might be pollution. Number 5, we have also failures in the knowledge generation and distribution process. How is knowledge created, and how is it distributed? Is it distributed from a top-down model or a network model or what have you? Number 6, knowledge pollution. This is a real problem today. We have the fake news phenomenon and such spread by the social media. Number 7, the growth of malevolent or benevolent value systems. And I would say any society we have with different value systems have both benevolent and malevolent elements. And how do you encourage the benevolent ones? And I think in the end it's number 8, due to the payoff system. How are powerful people paid in the society? From where do they come from? And I think of a saying by W.I. Thomas back in the early 1900s, who wrote about it's very difficult to get a man to see something he's paid not to see. 3 social organizers that motivate multiple selves in society. Boulding came up with this tie diagram, or triangle, threat, integrate, and exchange. And here he was talking about things that motivate us to act. And we can be motivated by threat, that is, do something or else, or you'll have to pay a price, or exchange, whereas you have a free market of exchange for goods and services. And then at the top, you have integrative systems, that is, like families, churches, communities, where people are given things and do things for others because of who they are and who the others are. And it's interesting that you wouldn't want to mix the things up. There was a sociologist, Garfinkel, would tell his students to go and act like a guest in their own home, which ended the parents asking their kids what the hell was wrong with them, because they were acting in a variation to this model. But anyway, any society is a mixture of all 3 of these drivers, these organizers, and it just varies from mixture. Okay, as we now in my work across the decades, I have been using this model developed in my dissertation of combining Aristotle with the work of George A. Kelly, a psychologist, and coming across with personal function and social role theory and how we operate. At the root of this is the three elements from Aristotle: logos, ethos, pathos, and analytical synthetic modes of construing from Kelly. And this has given me a robust model of human action that has been very productive for me to employ, and so I apply it here. Currently, as an expatriate academic in Papua New Guinea, I feel tensions in acting my expected social role as a learned Western professor and senior colleague versus my fallen, normal self. Given the social norms of this Gemeinschaft society, tribal society, I find that I often have to translate my more Gesellschaft-derived personal functional drivers, being that I came from the United States, into acceptable forms of the other frame. And Martin Mayer a psychologist, had talked about the self as a community of selves, referring to a community of two persons. And, I think of an old joke from a Southern humorist, Dave Gardner, who used to have a situation where he would say to people, Brother Dave, do you ever talk to yourself? And he said, sure I do. I like to talk to someone with some sense for a change. But in this case, Mayer puts it that we have a community of selves where we might have two minds about something, and we have to debate in our mind about an activity or a decision to make. But this gives us I would argue this gives us the realm of being able to practice empathy for others who are different from ourselves. And here in my personal functional model, you see it working, and I was applying this to literary text, reading and responding, but it could be used anything text-wise. How we respond to information we come into and how we act on it. And we have a tension within our personal self between our logos, that is, our thinking selves, and our pathos, or feeling selves. We may look at a work of art and say, oh, I really like that work of art, it speaks to me. Now I'll find good reasons why I should like it. On the other hand, we may look at a piece of art and say, I can see why someone might think that's a good piece of art, but I don't like it. And then that's another critical response. Whereas the one I like is when we like something we know we shouldn't like, and I call that the guilty pleasures. In any case, we work through this personal functional level model to come to decision making about how we respond to texts, social texts, and that we come across in our lives. And later I work it into a dimensions of transition model that you'll see next. Now this is more complicated. This is dealing with the roles of how we come up with professional level social judgments about literature, art, society, social theory, what have you. And again, the ethos part would be in the middle there at the points where you see the two diamonds at a point. That's where the ethos would start from the first model. And on one side, bottom, you have social role level model, and then you have on the other side, on one end, comprehensiveness, threat, which I'll talk about more. On the other end, incidentalism, fear, and these are things that we're dealing with now in our COVID crisis, and between anxiety and certainty. Okay, so we'll talk through this model more. But one rhetorical theorist, Wayne Brockreedy, had talked about rhetoric being the regulation of uncertainty. The notion being that if communication is certain, then it's predictable and boring. If it's totally uncertain, then it makes no sense at all. So we have a notion of you want a regulation of certainty about outcomes in society, but not too much certainty, but not too much uncertainty either. Crafting a social ethos, life work of balancing self and others. As I said in my dissertation work, one possibility would be to consider, the notion of a unified ethos forming the center intersection of core and superordinal constructs. Core constructs to Kelly would be the emotional drivers. Superordinal would be like the cognitive constructs that one creates to structure their life, activity. And this combination, ethos is the self that reflects to the world, is that what we see through our social roles. And I talk about the role of perception and reaction. Now, one issue that comes up now with the COVID-19 pandemic is how we deal with the social role in the notion of anxiety, stress, and how we respond. So Kelly, George A. Kelly, this American psychologist, had an interesting take on threats, fears, aggression, and hostility. And he said in one of his quotes that I ended up quoting, one tends to be threatened by which he construes comprehensively, is made fearful by which he construes simply. What threatens us is what we know a good deal about. What makes us fearful are things we know less about. We are threatened by hauntingly familiar things and frightened by unexpectedly strange things. And whether the disturbance is comprehensive or incidental, is the imminent likelihood of a sudden reconstruction of our core personalities that make it a disturbance. And how do we respond to this? Well, Kelly, interesting enough, uses aggressiveness in a positive, proactive way to refer to, like, if I'm facing a choice to respond to incoming change, I can get ahead of it and take creative action to make change. On the other hand, hostility would be a negative, reactive response to the imminent construct system change, trying to make a new reality fit old constructs. And there's the idea of Procrucius cutting the bed, his guests who come to his house to fit the bed rather than make a new bed. And so I would say in sum, we conclude that appropriate aggressive behavior is behavior that's socially validated by the commonality or sociology corollaries to be a valid response to the tensions we see, whereas hostile behavior is that socially invalidated behavior in which two individualistic persons insist on performing regardless of the consequences. So, one issue that we as academics, especially in the humanities, face is the problem of voice. And note at the beginning of the essay, when we profess within our professional role, what exactly are we professing? The truth and the often fictive human story we're explaining to our students, the rigor of the models of hermeneutical understanding we might deploy in the explication, our subject to ourselves. Even in the social sciences, the issue of complex interplay of the knower and the known, the subject and the object, arises often in a very human way. As my methodology and subject together have proved, the personal, functional, flesh and blood author and the social role functions of the public replied author, this is Wayne Booth's terminology, often commingle or collapse when we seek to enact our own beatific theoretical visions into a fallen world that we have. And to try to keep balanced all this and not go crazy as we are these days in isolation, I look at the work of Kenneth Burke in his attitude toward history. He was writing about the notion of, as I would say, and I put in one passage, as Kenneth Burke's comic correctives essay would have it, ambivalence allows us for an appropriate charitable attitude toward actors, unwillingly subject to the dialectical forces of society within history, wherein even high-minded institutions are tragically trapped betwixt Mammon, materialism, and utopian spiritualism. As he states, Kenneth Burke, a comic frame of motives is here conceived would not only avoid the sentimental denial of materialistic factors in human acts, it would also avoid the cynical brutality that comes when such sensitivity is outraged by the acts of others or by the needs of practical exigencies, just like now, that place upon us. As Jesus commanded us, we are not to be of this world, even as I am not of it. And as Jesus, this command would make us that we discount, supposedly, or outweighed by an affirmation of the infinite, an affirmation guided by faith. Given my extensive work of reason in the growth of academia and in the church, I had trusted that what knowledge I had gained over 9 years of mission work aids and does not undermine this core belief. For now, my future directions and research possibilities, I'm intrigued by the work of the Perspective Tiva Foundation. Jonathan Rawson, an analytic applied philosopher, has opened this foundation and is looking at synthetic research theme on intersection of systems, souls, and society. This seems to follow the trends of my own exploratory O3X model, and the O3X means it's like this: if you are injured in a car accident, say, and taken to the hospital, and they want to know if you're functional, the doctors will ask you 3 sets of questions, like, who are you? What's your name? Where are you? And what day is it? These set the idea of the O3X. So we have the self, we have where we are, location, and we have what time is it? Where, what year is it? And so I developed out of that a rather complicated model that you see next. This O3X organon, it transverses the same psychological territory of representation, expression, and appeal, seeking to answer the ontological question, who are you? And it's complicated, but it goes through different levels of knowledge and reaction between means of construing the social context and on one vector, and another vector is the vertical vector is image plays of society and concrete processes of daily life, the organic things I mentioned, and the images we make of it, the constructions we make of our reality. And then across that we have personal commitment cutting across time and the ethical choices we have to make in life. What do we do when we have limited time and value and our power to enact? We have to make real choices about what we do in life. Conclusions. As the psychologist Abraham Maslow's studies of the most successful people demonstrated, once the stage of self-actualization is properly completed, then and perhaps only then can one approach true generosity, pardon the expression, a generation of human action, perhaps discovering a way out of what Harold Bloom called the anxiety of interpretation, relieved by embracing the inevitable misprision of language in our bodies. Logos should stand for truth, however imperfectly perceived for our senses and passions, if nothing else. Thank you for your attention.